Look closely at a small wooden statue in a temple in eastern Kyoto. A thin monk is walking forward. Sandals, a worn robe, a staff in one hand, a small gong hanging at his chest. His mouth is open. Nothing about him looks dangerous. Then you notice the wire. 6 tiny golden Buddhas are coming out of his mouth. They are strung on a fine strip of metal, hovering in the air just past his lips, each one no larger than your thumb. That statue stands in Roku Haramitsuji. It was carved in the 13th century by a sculptor named Kosho, a son of the great master Unkei, and the monk it shows is Kuya, who had already been dead for 200 years when the wood was cut. The 6 little figures are not a vision. They are not a miracle. They are a sentence, made solid. 6 syllables, carved as 6 bodies, because by the time that statue was made, those 6 syllables had become the most disruptive thing an ordinary person in Japan could say out loud. Why would anyone be afraid of 6 syllables? Here they are. Namu Amida Butsu. In plain English, roughly, I take refuge in the Buddha of infinite light. That Buddha is Amida, and the promise attached to him is simple enough to explain in one breath. Long ago, before he became a Buddha, he vowed that anyone who called on him in sincere trust would be reborn in his Pure Land, a realm in the West where enlightenment is no longer a struggle but a certainty. Not a heaven exactly, a place where the work finally becomes possible. Say the name, be carried there. That is the whole mechanism. You are looking at a religion with no entry fee. Hold that thought, because for most of Japanese history, salvation had a price list, and it was long. Walk back 300 years from that statue into the Heian capital. In the 11th century, educated Japanese believed the world had entered its final decline. The teaching had a name, Mappo, the age of the last Dharma, when the Buddha's words survive, but no one can actually practice them well enough to matter anymore. Scholars had run the calculations and fixed the beginning of that age at the year 1052. Then the world obliged. Plague moved through the capital. Warrior bands fought in the streets of a city built for poetry. Temples on the mountains kept armed men. Imagine being told with the full authority of every learned person you know that you were born after the last exit closed. So the aristocracy did what wealthy people do when they are frightened. They built. In 1053, 1 year after the Age of Decline was supposed to begin, the regent Fujiwara no Yorimichi turned his villa outside Kyoto into the Phoenix Hall of Byodo-in, a hall of gold and lacquer designed to look like the Pure Land had touched down in a pond. It is still standing. If you have ever held a Japanese 10-yen coin, you have held a picture of it. His father, Fujiwara no Michinaga, the most powerful man in the country, had died in 1027 in a hall he built for the purpose, lying before an enormous image of Amida, holding 5 colored cords tied to the statue's hands so that the Buddha could pull him across at the moment of death. That is what salvation looked like at the top. Gold leaf, 9 statues, priests chanting scriptures in classical Chinese, a language perhaps 1 in 100 people could read. Rituals timed by professionals, endowments of rice land, decades of study on a mountain for the men who performed them. Now, put yourself in a farming village in the same century. You cannot read. You will never own land. Your work requires you to kill. You flood fields and drown insects. You gut fish. You snare birds. By the standards being preached at you, that is a life of unavoidable wrongdoing. What exactly is a person like that supposed to do? For a long time, the honest answer was very little. Give what you can to the temple. Hope to be reborn as someone with better options. Which is why the man in that statue mattered. Kuya, who lived from 903 to 972, did not stay on the mountain. He walked into markets, into riverbeds where the poor buried their dead, into villages, striking his gong and chanting the name of Amida out loud so that anyone could hear it and repeat it. People called him the saint of the marketplace. 2 centuries later, a sculptor tried to show what he had done and found there was no way to carve a sound. So he carved the syllables as 6 small Buddhas, escaping into the open air, where anyone could catch them. Here is where the obvious explanation appears, and here is where it breaks. The obvious explanation is that the chanted name was a shortcut, a simplified version of real practice, handed down to people who could not manage the difficult version, something for the illiterate, while the serious work continued in the monasteries. That is exactly what the monasteries thought too. It is not what the teaching says. The man who made the difference was Honen, born in 1133, a scholar of formidable reputation who spent decades on Mount Hiei, the great Tendai monastery complex above Kyoto, and who by his own account read the entire Buddhist canon more than once. In 1175, working through a Chinese commentary, he reached a conclusion that ended his career as a respectable monk. His argument was not that calling the name is easier. His argument was that everything else does not work. Not for anyone. Not for him. In an age of decline, he taught, the self-powered path, meditation, precepts, learning, discipline, austerity, is beyond the actual capacity of actual human beings, including the ones who look most successful at it. And a Buddha of genuine compassion would never make rescue depend on an ability most people do not have. So Amida selected the one practice that excludes no one. That is the word Honen used, selection, senchaku, and he put it in the title of the book he wrote in 1198 at the request of the retired regent Kujo Kanizane. Read that again and feel the floor tilt. The chanted name was not the lesser version for the poor. It was the primary version, and everything the wealthy had built, the gold hall, the 9 statues, the endowments, the Chinese scriptures, the years on the mountain, was the detour. If that is true, then the entire apparatus of religious authority in Japan is not a bridge. It is a toll booth on a road that never needed one. Honen's student Shinran, born in 1173, then pushed the idea somewhere even harder to hold. If salvation comes entirely from Amida's vow and not from your own effort, Shinran reasoned, then the person most likely to grasp it is not the disciplined saint. The disciplined saint is quietly convinced he is doing the work himself. The person who knows he cannot possibly earn it, the hunter, the fisherman, the soldier, the woman told her body is an obstacle, has nothing to be confident about, except the promise. A record of his sayings, the Tanisho, written down after his death by a follower named Heian, puts it in a line that has unsettled readers ever since. Even a good person attains birth in the Pure Land, so how much more so the wicked person? That text is a memory of what Shinran said, not a manuscript in his hand, and it was written precisely because his students were already arguing about what he had meant. The uncertainty is part of its afterlife. But Shinran lived the logic. He married a woman named Eshini. He had children. He ate what ordinary people ate. He called himself Gutoku, a foolish stubble-haired one, and described himself as neither monk nor layman, because if the vow is real, the wall between the holy specialist and the ordinary person has no load-bearing function. You may be starting to see why the 6 syllables were dangerous. In 1207, the court moved. The retired emperor Go-Toba was away on pilgrimage to the Kumano shrines. While he was gone, 2 of Honen's disciples, Anraku and Juden, led an all-night service of chanting, and 2 women of his court were so moved that they took vows and shaved their heads without his permission. The reaction was not theological. Anraku and Juden were executed. Honen, then 74 years old, was stripped of his clerical status and banished to the island of Shikoku. Shinran, 34, was exiled to Ichigo on the cold northern coast and given a criminal civil name. Chanting the name in the exclusive way Honen taught it was formally suppressed. Consider what had actually been proposed: a path to salvation that requires no temple, no ordained specialist, no donation, no literacy, no ritual timing, no permission, and no social rank. Nothing in that list can be taxed, nothing in it can be rationed, granted, or withheld. An institution can survive heresy. It cannot survive becoming unnecessary. And it did not stop there. Later in the century, a wandering monk named Ippin took the practice on the road and turned it into something you could hear from the next valley, dancing chant, performed in the open on raised wooden platforms, whole crowds moving and calling the name together. He handed out paper slips printed with the 6 syllables to anyone who would take one, believer or not. The illustrated scroll made about his life in 1299 counts the slips in the millions, a figure no one can verify, though the point of the number is clear enough. 2 centuries after that, the descendants of these communities had organized into leagues that could field armies. In 1488, the province of Kaga on the Japan Sea coast was seized by one such league and effectively governed itself for roughly 100 years. In 1570, Oda Nobunaga began a war against the fortress temple of Ishiyama Honganji in what is now Osaka. It took him 10 years to force a surrender, longer than any castle he ever besieged. 6 syllables, available to anyone, no entry fee. Now go back to the statue with the wire. The temple that holds it is a short walk from the Kyoto neighborhoods where warriors and merchants lived, and the object has stayed roughly where it has always been for around 800 years, while the capital burned repeatedly around it. You can still stand in front of it, and you can still hear the sentence it is carving. Pure Land Buddhism did not fade into a curiosity. The lineage that runs from Honen through Shinran is the largest Buddhist tradition in Japan today, with the 2 vast Honganji temple complexes sitting in the middle of Kyoto, minutes from the main railway station, on ground far too valuable to belong to a small movement. Walk into a Japanese home with a butsudan, the household altar, and the words carved out of that wooden mouth are the words most likely to be said in front of it. Whether Kosho the sculptor meant all of that, we have no way of knowing. He left no explanation. He left a monk, a gong, a wire, and 6 small Buddhas walking out into the air. But the question the 6 syllables ask has not aged at all, and it is aimed straight at you. If the thing that matters most cannot be earned, cannot be bought, and cannot be deserved, then what do you imagine you have been working for?